Let's get started on Chapter 9, Server Management and Administration. This is a big chapter. In this chapter, we will study what's a domain controller, Active Directory replication, and Active Directory management. We will look at user accounts, user account properties, groups, permissions, the administrator group, hard disks, partitions and volumes, and NTFS. We will look at quotas, sharing, network printing, and a network print server. We will look at event viewer, performance monitor, key variables, and baseline. We will look at RAID level 1, RAID level 0, disk spanning, RAID level 0+1, and RAID level 5, and fault tolerance. Many of you here are taking this course because you plan to pursue a career in networking. And this chapter addresses the tasks that you would be performing if you were a network administrator. And a large part of your job as a network administrator is in managing domains. So let's go to page 398 and discuss what is a domain. A domain is an organization or a company. It's a group of people and computers that work together for a common purpose. And a domain controller is a server that has Active Directory installed on it. Active Directory is a database of usernames and passwords, and the purpose of Active Directory is authentication. The user stands at a workstation and he logs into Active Directory, which is located on the domain controller. The domain controller could crash at any time, so we typically have 2 or more domain controllers. The contents of the first domain controller is replicated to the other domain controllers, and that way, if any domain controller crashes, that's okay. We have another domain controller available to authenticate users. Let's now look at managing user and group accounts on page 369. Particularly, we are looking at managing users and groups in Active Directory. So let us look at creating user accounts, page 398. Why would you create a user account? Well, if a new employee was hired, you would create a user account so that new employee could log on. To create a user account, we go to Server Manager and we go to Active Directory Domain Services. And under Active Directory Users, we select the user's container and we right-click and select New and select New User. We then type in the first name of the user, such as Bob, and the user's last name, such as White, and we assign the user a login name, which is usually going to be the first letter of the first name followed by the last name. Then we click on Next. We assign the user a password and we confirm the password. We do click off on the checkbox that says user must change password at next login, but we do not click off on the checkbox that says user cannot change password. We don't click off on the checkbox that says password never expires, and we certainly don't want to disable the account because the whole reason we're doing this is so the user can get logged on. We click on Next, and to create the new user, we click on Finish. And now the user, Bob White, has a user account, and now he can log on to the domain. What if a user forgets his password? As administrators, we cannot see what somebody's password is, but we can give the person a new password. To give a user a new password, we right-click on the user account and select Reset Password. Then we type in the new password and we tell the user what the new password is. And then the user logs in using the new password, and when he does, he is required to change that password as soon as he logs in. When the employee leaves the company, we delete the account, because if somebody is not an employee, they should not be able to log in to the domain. Now let's look at user account properties: login name, time restrictions, account locked, disabled, or expired, home folder and profile, and group membership. If I go to my user account and I right-click and I select Properties, under the General tab, I can see that the user's first name is Bob and his last name is White. If I go to the Account tab, I can see that his login name is bwhite@ccbc.edu. If I look at the user's login hours, I can see that if I want to, I could restrict that user so he can only log on from 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. Monday through Friday. And then we have a user property that says account, that says unlock account. As an administrator, you cannot lock an account. You can only unlock the account. The way an account gets locked is if somebody is trying to log on and it gets the password wrong too many times, and that locks the account. And then as an administrator, you can then go and unlock the account. But you can't lock it. The only way it gets locked is if somebody gets the password wrong too many times. And then we have another variable here that says account is disabled. Don't mix that up with unlock account. If somebody is leaving the company for an extended period of time, but they're not quitting the company, they're just not going to be around for a while, and you don't want them to be able to log on, you click on the checkbox that says account disabled, and then they can't log on until you clear the checkbox. And then account expires addresses temporary employees. If you have hired somebody for just 90 days, you set the account expiration date to 90 days past when you create the user account. And then after 90 days, they can't log in anymore. Now, if you want to extend that time another 90 days, you can. So if a user cannot log on, this is where you would typically come to try to figure out why. If Bob White says he can't log on, first I would see if I can log on myself. And if I can log on, then I know the domain controller itself is up and running. Then I go into Active Directory and I verify, does Bob White even have a user account at all? And yes, he does. And then I would verify to make sure that Bob White was using the right user login name. I would verify that he is not trying to log in during disallowed login hours. I would verify that the account is unlocked, that it is not disabled, and that the account has not expired. If a user can't log on, usually going to the Account tab of the user properties will often help you figure out why. Let's now go to the Profile tab. And if we look in the Profile tab, we will see there are two variables there: Home Folder and User Profile. Let's talk about Home Folder first. If a user is at his workstation and simply clicks on Save, the file will be saved on the hard disk of the local workstation where the user is standing. If a user simply saves a file, it will be saved to the hard disk of the local workstation where the user is standing. If the user then goes to another computer and tries to open the file, the user won't be able to access the file because it was stored on the hard disk of another computer. It's really better if the user saves the files up on the server. Now, the way it's configured right now, home folder local path, if the user saves the files, they'll be saved to the local workstation. But if we select the radio button that says connect, and then we type in /server1 /users /% username %, then Whenever the user goes to save a file, the file will be saved up on the server to the folder called users, to the folder that corresponds to the user's login name. If we set home folder to connect to server1 /users / username %, then when a user saves a file, it will be saved up to the server in that user's home folder. And that way, if a user goes to another workstation, he can still access his files. So that's the home folder. It can be on the local workstation, but it's really better to be up on the server. Now let's address what's meant by the user profile. The user profile, discussed on page 407, stores user environmental variables. Here's the example. Whenever the user changes anything on his computer, those variables are saved in the profile. If a user adds shortcuts to his desktop, that's stored in the profile. If the user changes his screen colors, that's stored in the profile. If the user selects high contrast black, now why would anybody do that? Well, if you don't have very good eyes, it's hard to see the screen. But if you select high contrast black, it's much easier to see the screen. So if you change the screen colors to high contrast black, then that will be saved to the profile. The profile is typically, by default, stored on the hard disk of the local computer where the user is logged in. So if the user changes his screen colors, those changes will be saved on the profile, which is on the hard disk of the local PC. If the user goes to another computer, then the screen colors will not follow him. So here's what we want to do. We want the profile to be saved up to the server. And that way, regardless of where the user goes, the screen colors will follow the user. In order to save the profile up to the server, if you don't type anything, it'll be saved to the local workstation. But in order to get the profile to be saved to the server, you would typically have the profile saved in the same place where the user's home folder is saved. /server1 /users / username %. That means when the user makes any screen changes, they will be saved to the profile, which is located on the server under the folder called users, in a folder which corresponds to the user's login name. If we do that, then the user's profile will be saved centrally up to the hard disk on the server. And then if a user goes to another computer, the user's screen colors will still be available. When the profile is saved up to the hard disk on the server, they call that, page 408, a roaming user profile. A roaming user profile is a profile which is stored on the server, and it allows the user to roam from one workstation to the next. So if we have the home folder saved up on the server, and if the profile is saved up on the server, then the user can go to any workstation and save his files, and they'll be saved to the server. And the screen colors will be saved to the server. And if he goes to any other workstation, the files will still be available, and the screen colors will still be available. Now, let's look at group membership. If we click on the tab that says Member Of, we can see that by default, the user is a member of the domain users group. If we wanted to add the user to another group, we would click on Add, and we could add the user to the administrators group, or we could add the user to the sales group. So user account properties include the user login name, time restrictions, account locked, account disabled, and account expired, and it's easy to mix those three up. Home folder or profile, which can be located on the local PC or can be saved up to the server, and group membership. So this leads us to groups. So now let's go to page 403 and discuss groups. The purpose of a group is to allow you to assign permissions to a large number of users. So now let's discuss permissions on page 420. We have a folder here called payroll, and there's the payroll database, and that is confidential information. We don't want just anybody accessing the payroll database. So here's what we do. We right-click on the payroll database and we select properties, and under security we specify that only certain people or groups can have access to the payroll folder. This is called adding permissions. If I click on add, I can give permissions to users one at a time. But if we have a large number of people doing payroll, instead of assigning permissions to users, one user at a time, which can be awfully time consuming if we have a lot of people doing payroll, what we do is we add a user, we create a group called the accountants group, we add users to the accountants group, and then we give permissions to the accountants group. When we give permissions to the accountants group, all people who were members of the accountants group then have access to modify the payroll database. So in groups, you create the group, then you add users, and then you assign permissions to the group. So to create a group, page 403, you go into Active Directory under the Users container, you right-click and you select New, followed by Group. You then type in the group name, such as the Managers Group. This is called a global group. It's used for holding users. And it's called a security group because it's for the purposes of assigning permissions. I click on OK, and now I have created a new group called the Managers Group. If I right-click on the Managers Group and select Properties, I can see there are no members of the Managers Group. So to add members to the Managers Group, I click on Add, followed by Advanced, and I click on Find Now, and I add all of the people who I want to add to the Managers Group. And then I click on OK, and now these people are a member of the Managers Group. And then the next thing I do is I assign permissions to the group. So I go to the folder where I want to assign permissions, I right-click, I select Properties, I click on Add, and then I add the group that I want to assign permissions to that folder. So with groups, you create a group, you add users, and then you assign the permissions to the group. And any permissions that you assign to the group, assign permissions to all the people who are members of the group. The administrators group. If you want somebody to have full power to create users and to delete users, you would then add them to the administrators group. If you take the user Bob and you add him to the accountants group, well, then he might have permissions to access the payroll database. But if you add him to the administrators group, then he is going to have full power over that computer, the ability to create and delete users, to wipe the hard disk, to everything. So the purpose of groups, there are really two purposes. One purpose of groups is to assign users permissions to files. You add somebody to the accountants group, and then you give the group permissions to the payroll database. And a second purpose of having groups is to assign administrative privileges. If you add somebody to the administrators group, then they have full power to control that server, including creating users, deleting users, and creating groups. To create user accounts in Linux, the concept is the same. You create users, you add users to groups, and then you assign permissions. But Linux typically uses the command line, the CLI, the command line interface, to create users and groups. For example, to create a new user, I would type add user space Bob. To create a group, I would type add group space sales. And to add Bob to the sales group, I would type add Bob space sales. And then, of course, I would give the sales group the permissions to the folder that I want them to have access to. So In user and group account management, we create user accounts. Why? So people can log in. And then we configure user account properties, such as the times they can and can't log in, and group membership, and home folder and profile. We create groups, we add users to groups, and we assign permissions to groups. This is a large part of what you would be doing as a network administrator. And this concludes part 1.